It's a pleasure to be here back in Ann Arbor. And I'll go ahead and dive in since we're a little late. A little bit of motivation about this talk. All right. So here is an outline for the talk. I'll talk about the motivation. I'll go into the model that gives rise to an equilibrium and then a non-equilibrium thermodynamics model, and then finally some scientific findings. So starting with motivation, after studying here at Michigan, I graduated in the year 2000. I went to MIT for graduate school. I worked with Muriel Medard. I did a PhD in information theory, and it involves a lot of applied probability. And as I was finishing at MIT and on my way to a faculty position at the University of Illinois, I got the best piece of advice in my career. Muriel told me to delay my start date at Illinois and go do a postdoc in something wildly different. And so I ended up doing a postdoc with this gentleman, Emory Brown, who is a board-certified anesthesiologist at Mass General Hospital in the Harvard Health System, but he's also a professor of neuroscience at MIT. Most important for me is that he has a PhD in statistics. So all the information theory that I learned, I was able to use as the language to understand neurophysiology. And then later in my career, we got involved in technology development. So if you take a look at my career trajectory since being a professor, I started off at Illinois and I was primarily doing brain science work. And then in 2011, I moved from Illinois to University of California, San Diego. And around the same time, it turns out I lost my dad to pancreatic cancer, disease of the digestive system. He had lost his mom to stomach cancer, another disease of the digestive system. So I decided when I go to San Diego, I'm going to feel comfortable feeling uncomfortable again, just like I did in that neuroscience postdoc, and I'm going to learn things about the gut, even though I knew nothing about it. So we ended up spending a decade while I was at UC San Diego, spending time with gastroenterologists, trying to solve problems that went electrical engineering and gastroenterology. So that was primarily sort of stomach science. And then since moving to Stanford, around 2021, you start to hear about things like the gut-brain axis and whatnot. So I studied both of these things individually when I studied them in tandem. So in terms of the brain, it turns out that oscillations occur in the brain all the time. For instance, when you're in a sleep, something called slow wave sleep occurs. And it turns out that there are these traveling waves that occur during slow wave sleep. Secondly, when spindles occur, which also occur during non-REM sleep, there are these rotational waves that occur, and these are important for learning and memory. And so this is a very highly cited publication in Nature Reviews Neuroscience about this. Now, in terms of electrical oscillations in the body, it turns out that inside of our stomach, a lot of us don't realize this, but we have a nervous system in our gut. In fact, in China, they call the nervous system of your gut, they call it your second brain. So we have over 100 million neurons in the human digestive system. And if we focus on the stomach for a moment, one thing that's interesting is that we have these cells that are called the Cajal cells, and I call these things sometimes the neuromuscular maestros because they take information from the neurons in the digestive system and they relay it to information about contractions to propel food throughout the GI tract. And so just like neurons, they have ion channels and they have, if the membrane potential crosses the threshold, action potentials fire. What's really interesting about these cells is that they have a membrane potential that's always oscillating. Turns out it's genetically encoded. It's oscillating at a very low frequency, about 0.05 hertz. And so, and it turns out not only is it oscillating, and if you look at any individual one of these cells are interconnected. It turns out that they form a syncytium. They share a cytoplasm. So this creates really interesting electrical coupling between all of these cells. And there are these traveling waves that occur. And these traveling waves are basically what coordinate the propelling of food throughout your GI tract. So the takeaway lesson here is that in the nervous system of both the brain as well as of the body, traveling waves play a role. This is sort of the takeaway lesson here. So one of the things that we got involved in when I was at UC San Diego was placing multi-electrode arrays over the abdomen, and we were actually able to capture electrical activity associated with the stomach and capture the spatial propagation of this activity. And so in this example, you can see the wave is going from the top right to the bottom left. And in this other example here on the right, you have a bit more of a wave propagating in a more direct direction. So what we were able to do in a sequence of publications was to basically show that this corresponds to normal slow wave activity, basically going from mouth to anus, as the saying goes, For other situations, patients who have a diagnosis of a GI problem, we were able to show is that what might underlie the symptoms that they have is that these waves are actually traveling in an abnormal direction. Imagine, for instance, you have nausea or you have a reflux because rather than going top down, for instance, it's going bottom up or it's spreading in aberrant directions. So in a series of PhDs, as you can see here, I had students working on this. And so one key finding that we had in 2019 paper was the percentage of time that the waves were basically not going top down correlated with severity of symptoms in patients with GI disorders. And this was really important because this was the first demonstration of a non-invasive measure of physiology of the digestive system, of the upper GI system that actually correlates with your symptom severity. Believe it or not, that a lot of other things previously that were non-invasive did not correlate with your symptoms. And so as a doctor, the purpose of a doctor is to help you feel better. But if I take a measurement and it doesn't correlate with how you feel, it's arguably not relevant. So, as I alluded to, I talked about the brain a little bit, I talked about the stomach, and now we know these things are interconnected. And new work that we're doing in my research group is actually studying both of these systems in tandem and understanding how they coordinate with each other in the human. But the takeaway lesson, what I hope I've motivated you by, is that these type of wave-like phenomena are important for both the brain and the body. And so with that said, we'll make this an ECS talk now, and we'll inject some math. And so how do we think about multivariate phase relationships? So let's think about a very simple traveling wave, like a plane wave. And so first time I learned about waves was in Herb Winfel's class, but I took on electromagnetics, right? So this is a very, very simple plane wave, as we can see right here. And this is it's just a plane wave. I took two different snapshots in time, and I showed you the voltages. This is what the voltage trace would be at this location in time, and here's what it would be at another location in time. And now imagine I look at a different type of wave, like if I drop, drop a stone into a pond, and it generates this radial-like wave. This is what occurs. And so what I'm showing you, my apologies, this middle plot right here is a plot of the phases from between 0 and 2 pi, different spatial locations. And similarly, these are the phases. And it turns out when we care about wave-like activity, what we really care about are multivariate phase relationships. So what is a way for which we can think about multivariate phase relationships that can capture things like waves? Well, there's a famous finding about Kuru-Moto oscillations, and this is one of the simplest examples of nonlinear dynamics for which interesting things occur. And so the idea here is that each one of these y's right here represents the phase of a different oscillator. Omega is 2 pi times its frequency. So this is just the inherent frequency of each oscillator. But the idea is that some of these oscillators might be going slightly faster than others, but they're influenced by other adjacent oscillators. So notice I'm saying that the ith oscillator, its speed, the rate of change of its phase, is driven by its inherent rate of oscillation, but it can either be sped up or slowed down based upon the difference between its phase and the phase of nearby oscillators, y sub j minus y sub I. And we take this sine function right here. And if we think about if yj and yi are near each other, then we know that the sine of u is approximately u when u is near 0. So you can interpret this almost like a controller, right? Meaning that if the phase of yj, of oscillator j, is slightly ahead of oscillator I, then the difference will be positive. And so it's going to tell this oscillator to speed up a little bit. So oscillator I catches up. And on the flip side, if oscillator I is slightly ahead of oscillator J, then this sign will be negative, assuming that the difference is near 0. And it'll tell oscillator I to slow down. And what kappa ij encodes is the strength of the coupling between those two oscillators. So what I can show you in this video right here is just a standard Kuru-Moto setup. I just randomly initialize the phases. Each dot is the phase of a different oscillator. And you can see they're all kind of going at different speeds and they're moving around. And notice that kappa here is relatively small. It's close to 0. As I let kappa get very large, you see very rapidly they start off at random conditions, but now they're totally operating together. You see they're all going together. They're all completely in synchrony. So this Kuru-Moto model was originally, studied to understand synchrony between fireflies, a variety of different things, Strogatz and his bug. People remember this contemporary bug. What I care about now are situations where there are actually phase offsets. But it turns out we can take the Kuru-Moto model and we can slightly extend it. And what I do right here is I add this mu ij term. And the high level idea is what it's saying is that I want oscillator I and oscillator J to not be the same value, but on average to differ in phase by an amount mu ij. And depending upon the nature of these mu ij's, this actually can encode a traveling wave. So here's an example of a 2D grid of oscillators. The phases are initially oscillized and it's obeying this equation right here. And what you'll notice is that now it's starting to become a traveling wave, as we can see here. As this very nice spatial structure. Professor Fessler, my former teacher. Yes, sir.
So that I can follow you, I expect an oscillator to be a second order ODE, and this looks kind of almost zeroth order, right? So what am I missing? Maybe I don't understand what I see here.
You're bringing forth a great question. Are you thinking about in physics when we talk about the classical harmonic oscillator? Yeah, so that is a second order differential equation. But it's fundamentally related to this. It's fundamentally related to this. So in that setup, you have position and you have velocity. And if you take a look at the position and velocity, they actually operate on the unit circle, if you remember, right? Because it's x dot dot plus omega squared, x squared, I believe, equals 0. Yeah. So here the difference is that the key thing I'm describing is the phase of the oscillation.
I see.
So everything I'm talking about here is, so these y's are between 0 and 2 pi.
I see. Okay.
These are not the positions or the velocities, but they're intimately connected if we do a coordinate transformation. Yes, sir. Professor Winfield, also my former teacher.
There's a coupling, nearest neighbor coupling, or
So we want to look at the more general case where for all possible oscillators, there's a kappa. For every I and every j, there's a kappa ij pair. And we want to, ultimately what we want to do is we just want to have data. I want to behave like a statistician, and I want to infer what these coupling strengths are. Yes. So, yes, sir.
So why there's a sign? Is that something within the model or?
Yeah, this dates back to Koromoto's original work. As I alluded to, remember when u is near 0, sine u is approximately u? So let's imagine that the oscillators, the phases are not the exact same, but they're slightly near each other. If you replace the sign with just yj minus yi, this looks like a controller now. Do you agree to that? This is just a linear state space controller.
Yes.
Yeah, and so it's encouraging their differences to go near 0, which means that they're fully in synchrony. This is one way conceptually to think about it. Yeah, but there's a lot of proofs. There's a lot of rich theory. The Koromoto oscillator is one of the most highly studied examples of nonlinear dynamics that has really interesting behaviors that occur. So I'm using this as my motivation, and the key thing that I'm doing, just to add, is I want phase offsets because I don't want them to be completely in synchrony. I want there to be phase offsets like would occur with a traveling wave or with a spiral or any other type of wave. So I showed you this is what a picture of the wave-like phenomena looks like. So now let's go into how we can go about trying to, if I just have data, how can I try to estimate these relationships? And so I'll tell you 2 approaches, the first of which is equilibrium thermodynamics. And so in this setup, what I take advantage of is, this is the original Koromoto equation when I add the phase offset term. And what I want us to appreciate is that this kind of looks like a differential equation. There's nothing random here, but now imagine I built a stochastic differential equation where I have this random Brownian motion term here. Written this way, where this is the gradient on an energy function, we know that this system, provided certain symmetry conditions hold, will converge in equilibrium to an equilibrium distribution, which is governed by the Boltzmann distribution. For some of us who studied the stochastic differential equations, the high level idea is that this differential equation, this term right here has a gradient of the energy, and then this term right here is the energy term itself. So if I try to mirror this equation sort of with this equation right here, we can see that this term that has the signs in it is almost like the derivative of something. And we know that the sine and the cosine are related by derivatives. So this suggests that if this was my stochastic differential equation, so this is just a stochastic differential equation equivalent of Koromoto. If you see here, I just have this additive Brownian motion term here. The invariant distribution that this will converge to will be this Boltzmann distribution. And you see sines got mapped to cosines because sine and cosine relate via derivative. So now what I want to do is I want to study this probability distribution and try to infer its parameters. This is the high level idea right here. And so the key things I want to infer are the kappa, which are the strengths of the coupling, and also the mu's, which are telling me about the phase offsets between them. And as we notice right here, this is a graphical model, right? This is an exponential family. It's a graphical model, so we can describe it right here where the presence of an edge between 2 nodes represents where kappa ij is non-zero. Okay, And so what I can do then, because I want this to be an equilibrium distribution, it turns out that kappa needs to be a symmetric matrix. So I can just capture the the upper triangular entries. And so this is what I'm focused on right here. And so just to emphasize, mu ij is the phase offset between oscillator I and oscillator J on average. Kappa ij is the coupling strength between oscillator I and oscillator J. And then Z is the notorious partition function, right? To guarantee that this is a probability density and integrates to 1. And so notice I'm taking a sum over all pairs right here. So one thing that's nice about this is that the absence of an edge actually encodes conditional independence, which is really nice philosophically for people who study graphical models. And to sort of make this point clear, imagine you have a Gaussian random vector. Then we should be familiar with the fact that if I have a Gaussian random vector, then x1 and x2 are conditionally independent given all of their variables. So in general, this statement right here for an arbitrary random vector is if I can represent the joint distribution in this sort of fashion. And the high level idea right here is I have one function that involves all the edges but not two. And this other function h involves all the edges except except node 1. And so not a function of x2, not a function of x1. And so if we remember, the density of a Gaussian is given by this beautiful formula that we know very well, where it's a quadratic form in the exponent, x transpose sigma inverse x. And so if turns out I can rewrite this using basic linear algebra in terms of the sum over all pairs of xi, xj times the ij entry of the inverse covariance matrix. And so this is why if the ij entry of the inverse covariance matrix is 0, this encodes conditional independence between these two, given all others. So notice that I have a function of I and j, and then I have this sort of coefficient right here. When it's 0, it corresponds to conditional independence, as I'm alluding to right here. And so if we look at our problem, it's very, very similar. We have a function of I and j right here, and we have this coefficient. So we can use very, very similar analogy to show that this also encodes conditional independence. So that's something else that's really nice about this graphical model. Although I didn't start with this. Where I started was Kerr-Model, stochastic differential equation. This is the equilibrium distribution, but we get this nice property for free. So if the coupling is 0, then we have conditional independence between these two oscillators given all others. There's no direct connection. Okay, so that's nice. So what's nice about this is if I have a probability distribution on all these oscillators, I can do things like hypothesis testing. I can compute log likelihood ratio tests. I can do a lot of things that we do in engineering, and also I can characterize the inherent structure by virtue of the presence or absence of these edges. So now, how can I go about actually trying to infer this if I have data? That's the $64,000 question. And so first thing I'm going to do is, remember I said the things I care about are the kappas and the mu's. Kappa is, you see here, as a coefficient of this cosine, but notice that this mu is inside of this cosine, and that's kind of a pain. But what I can do is I can just use some simple tricks from high school trigonometry, and I can pull that out. And the high level idea is I can actually go from, the way to think about this is that this is almost like r cosine theta, and I can go from polar coordinates to Cartesian coordinates. So I can build theta ij cosine and then theta ij sine, and this is just a simple law of cosines, just a trick that we did in high school, going from polar to Cartesian coordinates. So now the parameters that I care about are these coefficients of the cosine of the difference and the coefficients of the sine of the difference. So this is the first thing that I can do, and that's an invertible transformation. So I can do that. These are my parameters to learn. A fun fact about when I start to look at it this way, this looks like an XY model from statistical physics, which is basically a generalization to the Ising model, or some of us have seen this before. And so in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to borrow from recent advances in studying the Ising model and solving for it to help us here. And so in particular, I'm just going to kind of give you the punchline, but what we're going to do is that recently there's been this technique called the interaction screening objective. And Vuffray et al. First had a publication in 2016 in NeurIPS. And what they were able to do was to solve for the Ising model, which is a notoriously difficult problem. And the key thing that makes this problem different is, remember, we have 1 over z, e to the, within the exponent. This stuff is linear in the exponent, but remember, these coefficients are inside of that partition function. They're inside of z. And so if I want to find for the optimal coefficients, I have to evaluate that partition function, compute gradients of it, but that's a notoriously hard sum or integral. So it turns out you can use this objective, and it does not involve the partition function. And with L1 regularization, you can do very nice things. So what I'm basically proposing to you is that we first use L1 regularization to basically identify the graphical structure. So I pick a coefficient lambda, the L1 norm, and I find, and so as we all know, the L1 norm is going to encode sparsity, and so some of these coefficients will be zero, some of these will be non-zero, and I can pick lambda carefully and I can prove nice things about it. And after I find which capital coefficients are non-zero, I basically solve another optimization problem that does not involve the L1 norm, and now I'm solving only over the edges that I identified that are present, and I can solve this problem. And so by doing this, I can actually give nice performance guarantees. And so this is in a preprint with my graduate student, Andrew. And what we're able to show is that if we pick lambda an appropriate way, I can basically guarantee, in short, that I can learn the parameters of this model very well. So the true underlying parameters versus what I found, I have nice properties about it. And secondly, I can give very nice properties about being able to capture the true structure. So are you an edge in this graph or not with very high probability? If I pick the coefficient carefully, I can guarantee that occurs. And so some of the, how we ended up doing this, we leveraged some recent results about the Ising model. And if we remember the Ising model, the values are only +1 and -1, whereas here we're between 0 and 2 pi. But if you think about that, 0, that's like cosine of theta at certain values of theta. So there's all this beautiful symmetry that occurs with these intervals, and all this symmetry we can leverage and we can actually prove nice theorems. So this is part of a performance guarantees, and so I can show you some computational experiments we're able to do. Imagine now I generate noisy plane waves in 16 different directions. The probability distributions, I want to do hypothesis testing. And so how I go about doing this is the high level idea is I generate something like a traveling wave, and then I can basically compute the Hilbert transform at any moment in time at every spatial location to get the phase as a function of time. So now I have the multivariate phase as a function of time, and I basically am going to learn the probability distribution for each of these given the procedure that I did before. And now on new data, when I embed in new noise, I'm going to do a log likelihood ratio test, and I'm going to see how this performs. And I'm going to generate waves that are very, very similar to each other. So 0 degrees, or 22.5 degrees, 45 degrees. So these only shift by about 22.5 degrees. And what I can show you is that basically, when I show you the confusion matrix, it does quite a good job. And so here's an 80-20 train test split. And if you look at this confusion matrix, you see how good of a job it does. So basically all I'm doing is bread and butter EE undergrad probability, log likelihood ratio test stuff after I've learned the model with the procedure that I described. And it does quite a good job at being able to distinguish things even 22.5 degrees. And we see where it's wrong, it's only wrong. Like if it's going 22.5, you predict 0 or you predict 45, it only slightly goes wrong. So another instance of why this is relevant is for different type of sensor densities, if I want to test different types of wave phenomena that's occurring. So as I alluded to before, when I was at UC San Diego, I had graduate students that characterize healthy controls versus patients, and we saw these waves either went in like a top-down, mouth-to-anus fashion or in some type of aberrant direction as shown in part B. So one of the recent things we've done with one of my graduate students at Stanford is that we developed novel ways to build multi-electrode arrays so that we can capture this multi-electrode activity in humans compatible with large-scale manufacturing. And so my student Lane, who published this work, she presented at a pitch competition at the Neural Engineering Research Conference and won first place, won the pitch competition. So there's a lot of fun opportunities now where we can actually design these to be flexible, compatible with large-scale manufacturing. But natural questions start to arise, which are, how dense of an array should this be? Should I build an array where it's very, very dense, where every electrode is very, very small area? Or should I have an array that has a smaller number of very large electrodes? And so what we can do is we can basically ask questions about sensor density, and we can ask the question, how well can I distinguish a wave that's going in a top-down fashion versus in a direction where it's spreading outward, like when you drop a puddle into the pond? If I do a hypothesis test on that, how good is the ROC curve as a function of different sensor densities? This is the fundamental question. So this is important for designing sensor arrays. Now with the tools that we developed, we can do that. And so I might want to build an array that looks like this, that's relatively dense, or we want to build an array like this that's much, much denser. Obviously, there are trade-offs in that a more dense array, anyone who does VLSI or other things, this becomes more complicated for the processing, the layout, all these things. So we probably want to be as dense as possible, but not much more. But how can I go about thinking about this? Well, we also know that there's something called a Nyquist limit for being able to detect spatial patterns in data. So anyone who remembers waves and their phenomena, there's actually Just like in the Fourier domain across time, there's a Fourier domain across space when we look at traveling waves. And so as such, there's a Nyquist criterion that occurs. Oversampling generally can help us perform better, but it comes at the cost of obviously making these things more expensive. Where's the point of diminishing returns? So basically, we can solve that problem now. So just to remember, we're trying to do a hypothesis test on is this a plane wave versus a diverging wave? And what we can start to do is we can start to ask if I build a 3x3 array versus a 4x4 array versus a 5x5, a 6x6, or a 7x7, we can actually show you the area under the curve of how that's behaving. And we can start to see that once we get to around 6x6 or so, the area under the curve is not increasing that much afterwards. I mean, you could argue even after 5x5. So you can start to see how these probabilistic tools can interface with designers building technologies to optimize for certain applications. So yeah, this is one. Yeah, and so we're going to HU with people who are building these types of arrays for building traveling waves in the brain, and we're helping guiding their design process using these types of tools.
Can I just stop for there?
Yes, sir.
Is that, so the orientation or the direction of travel is known here? It's just a binary classification of those two different patterns you showed there?
As I showed right here, but there's a variety of things that you could start to ask. So one of the things I hope you can appreciate is that we can already characterize waves of the same type, like traveling waves, but going in different directions from that other confusion matrix I showed. So here we just focused on different types of waves, like a traveling wave versus one that's spiraling outward, like the radial wave, like when you drop the drop the puddle into the pond. Yeah. So everything that I did so far built upon this Boltzmann distribution type of framework. Just to remind ourselves, this is what we did. We had the original Kuramoto equation with the phase offsets. And what we did is we used this stochastic differential equation approach. And then remember that gives rise to this Boltzmann. But it turns out the Boltzmann based approach may not always be relevant for what we care about. So I'd like to make the argument that many physiologic systems are actually probed with stimulus response paradigms, right? Like I stimulate the brain and I want to watch what responds, or you eat a meal and the stomach is responding to your meal. So whenever I'm stimulating a system and then it's responding, it's not in equilibrium. So those transient dynamics are important to me. And that Boltzmann distribution is actually not going to help me with that. I actually want to go back to the non-equilibrium thermodynamics, which is governed by the Langevin equation. And so that's this equation that I show right here. So if I just unroll the derivative for a minute, so even my niece, who's a psychology major, I hope she remembers that dy dt means y t plus delta minus y of t divided by delta. So if I just unravel that, I get this equation that I get right here. So hopefully it's clear to everyone that literally all I'm doing is I'm taking this equation, I'm using the definition of the derivative. So the left-hand side is t plus delta, the right-hand side is yi times t plus delta. Delta is the time interval between two of these. This is this underlying equation. And now I have this additive term. And remember, typically when we think about stochastic differential equations, we think about this Brownian motion, right, which is a Gaussian nature. But remember, these are oscillators that go between 0 and 2 pi. So I have to put this modulo 0 2 pi operation here. And so this starts to become fun because it turns out if I take a Gaussian and I do a modulo 0 2 pi, that becomes something called a circular Gaussian. And then the limit of very small time intervals, that basically converges to something called a von Mises distribution. And so a von Mises distribution is like it's the maximum entropy distribution for circular random variables. So it's the analogy to the Gaussian, and it's the uniform limit of a circular Gaussian and the limit of the sampling interval becoming small. And so it basically has two parameters. It has this parameter nu, which is like the inverse variance. So the larger nu is, the more sharp the distribution is, and mu is the average value that it takes. So as you see right here, this is a phase variable. Mu is the average variable it takes, and you see these. If I were to draw many samples from here, mu is basically encoding. It's basically the inverse of the variance. So the larger the mu is, the less variance. So hopefully what you can appreciate is that if this is the top equation, notice what I'm saying is that on average, I have this constant plus this thing that's like a zero mean Gaussian, but now it's wrapped. So what that means then is this is a von Mises where its average value is this stuff right here, the yit plus delta times this term. And then it turns out the nu is inversely proportional to the sampling interval. Okay, so the smaller the sampling interval, the larger nu is. Okay, so this is the conditional distribution of oscillator at time t plus 1, given all the other oscillators up until time t. So, and notice that it's e to something that has a cosine in it. And so remember the trick that I played before where I originally wanted kappas and mu's, but I instead can perform the, the polar Cartesian trick? So that's the first thing I'm gonna do. I'm basically just gonna perform 3 tricks to solve this maximum likelihood estimation. First one is going from polar to Cartesian coordinates. Okay, so what that means now is I can represent everything in terms of a kappa matrix, where now it's twice as big because it has the cosine part and the sine part. And these are the key parameters that I want to infer. So everything is encoded by this kappa matrix. And so if you look at the structure of the stochastic differential equation, there's a lot of conditional independencies. So you see a lot of products right here. And now what I really need to care about is just the, the conditional distribution of one of these oscillators at time t+1, given all the oscillators up until time t. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm now going to investigate what this looks like. And if we remember, this guy is a von Mises. And I sum all these up and I perform the minimization procedure to compute maximum likelihood. Okay, so I already told you that this thing is a von Mises. And remember, a von Mises is basically an e to something times a cosine. And then I have this other dangling term that's not going to matter, it turns out. Okay, so if I focus on, now after I take the log, I eliminate the exponents, and now I have nu times a cosine. And I have all these terms. So I'm going to perform that little trig identity. Cosine of A minus B is sine A, sine B, plus cosine A, cosine B. You guys did this stuff in high school. Okay? So I'm just going to cleverly perform this trick where I let A be the stuff that I'm showing right here, and I'm going to let B correspond to this stuff right here. And the reason I'm letting B be that is notice that B has a coefficient of delta in there. And what does delta represent? Delta represents basically the time between 2 samples. So if you remember, these oscillators on average are oscillating at a certain frequency. And let's imagine I'm talking about the stomach. So that's 0.05 hertz. But let's imagine I sampled a lot faster than it. I mean, think about it. If I have an A to D, it might sample at like a kilohertz or something, or 250 hertz. Let's imagine it's sampled at 1 hertz. So notice that delta is much, much smaller than the inherent frequency, or much larger. The delta is the sampling frequency is a lot larger than the inherent frequency, which means that delta is a lot smaller than the inherent period of the oscillation. Assuming that's the case, so let's step back and see what we did. So this just came from that equation of the von Mises density. So for everyone, and remember what I care about are the kappa terms. So this dangling term with the negative log of a Bessel function goes away because it's not a function of kappa. So I don't care about it. But what I care about is kappa is inside of this cosine. That's a pain because cosine is a very nonlinear function. Is everyone happy with that? Trying to optimize something and it's a weird function. But now I perform my cosine trick. Notice that this sine term right here is all just a function of my data. These are all my y's and my inherent omega. So this is just data. Similarly for this cosine term. But now notice inside of here I have sine and I have cosine, and both of these terms have a delta as a coefficient, where delta is very small if I have a high sampling rate. So now what I can do is I can use my beloved small angle approximation. And the small angle approximation basically says that when u is near 0, sine u is approximately u, and cosine u is approximately 1 minus 1/2 u squared. This is literally just the definition of the derivative. Just doing the second order derivative, you get this for free, okay? And so as long as my delta, as long as my sampling rate is a lot faster than the inherent rate of the oscillations, then I can perform this. And this is a uniformly good approximation. This is a uniformly good approximation. So now what I can do is I can replace sine of this stuff that's linear in kappa with just something linear in kappa. And this cosine is something that's quadratic in kappa. And so that's all I'm doing right here. So the sine term is now going to be linear in kappa. And I'm going to have this other term that's going to be quadratic in kappa. And there's no need to go into all the details, but the takeaway lesson is that this is a quadratic minimization problem. If I want to minimize, a0 plus a1x plus, a2x squared, there's a closed form solution for that. There's an algebraic solution. Take the derivative and set it to 0. So what this means is that I can actually come up with an algebraic solution to this, provided that I sampled sufficiently fast. And so just the punchline of the tools that we use is we perform just a polar coordinate transformation, this trig identity about cosine A minus B, and then lastly, the small angle approximation, which is a uniformly good approximation, as delta as my sampling rate is really fast. And the key point we notice right here is that I get this quadratic and then a linear term with cosine and sine. So what can we do with this, right? So then the first question we can ask is, let's imagine I generated data and it was in equilibrium. let me see how the equilibrium procedure that I showed did, the first part with my student Andrew, and then let me see how the non-equilibrium approach does. So this is a symmetric kappa matrix. I generate the data in equilibrium. When I use the interaction screening procedure with the Boltzmann distribution, right? You see it's doing a pretty good job. You can see that this picture looks a lot like this picture. Now, when you do the one that doesn't even assume equilibrium, it still does a pretty good job. I hope you can agree. And these are just some plots showing F1 scores. And something else I just showed for fun, but if you didn't take into consideration the stochastic differential equation and just try to do linear regression, it does a horrible job. That's what these bottom plots are. So just trying to do bread and butter linear regression, not taking into consideration the circular nature, it does bad. Now, what does the best, if I know that I'm in equilibrium, not surprising, the interaction screening procedure, the equilibrium procedure does the best, but not far behind it is our non-equilibrium procedure. So that's nice. So this is one setup, a controlled setting. But now let's imagine I generate the data and it's not in equilibrium. How do things perform? Takeaway lesson is that linear regression sucks, not surprising. The equilibrium procedure now does substantially worse. So if I try to take an equilibrium viewpoint, but the data is fundamentally dynamic and not in equilibrium, you get a substantial performance hit. And what does the best is actually our Kuramoto approach. So just to sort of communicate some trade-offs, so let's all agree that linear regression sucks. So the only good thing about it, okay, it's fast, okay, but it sucks. Keep in mind, our Kuramoto approach basically is also an algebraic solution. So it has on order the same amount of complexity as linear regression. So this is generalizable to asymmetric interactions, to non-equilibrium settings, to high dimensional because it's algebraic. The one challenge I will say is that, to be fair to my former, so the interaction screening for equilibrium was done by my former student, Andrew. Where this thing benefits is that this thing doesn't actually need to know the inherent frequency of the oscillations, right? So what you can do, so it turns out there are ways, and this happens with brain neuroscience data, we actually bandpass filter the data to a very, very wide band. So it's not clear what the omega is, and we can still extract the phase. So there's a Nature 2020 paper that showed how this is important to do, and there are ways that we can get a wide band measure of phase. The procedure that involves equilibrium, there's no inherent omega that's there. It was just the differences between the phases. It doesn't need to know what an omega is. So if you're in a setting where you have wide band, then the interaction screening performs well. Our Kuramoto approach, if you remember the generative model, there's an omega term there. Every oscillator, I need to know its inherent omega. So if we're narrow band, where we know that the oscillations are primarily in a narrow band, then it works well. But if we're in a wide band regime, that's something that currently we don't have a solution for. So as always, nothing is perfect. So in terms of scientific findings we were able to establish with this, we first got some data from a paper by Eddie Chang, who's a neurosurgeon at UC San Francisco. And he had a paper where they basically took a look at patients that have depression, and they actually do deep brain stimulation to the orbital frontal cortex. And one of the things that they found when they did this is that if you take a look at the theta band of the EEG, so the good news is that the narrow band setting, what they found was that after you stimulate the orbital frontal cortex as compared to before, you see, depending upon where you're looking at, you see an abrupt change in the power in the theta band. So one of the things that perhaps could be interesting about this is that if we think about an increase in power in EEG frequency band, anyone who does neuroscience related work, what we're measuring from the EEG is basically a superposition of a lot of oscillating activity of neurons nearby in cortex. And if we have more power there, that could be suggestive that where that superposition is coming from, they're more phase aligned. And therefore we have like this principle of superposition in phase coordinated sort of oscillations. So we asked the question, because they had multi-electrode data with intracranial EEG, we actually got the individual electrodes in the intracranial EEG, and rather just taking a look at the EEG power, we took a look at individual electrodes, and not surprising, if you take a look at the coupling coefficients, we see a reduction when stimulation occurs, and then we see a rebound afterwards. And this is a phenomenon that happens quite often, is that when you have the stimulus response occur, we see this sort of reduction in coupling within the time window of the stimulus, and then it sort of rebounds. Another example of this within the context of the stomach that we studied is that something else that we did with the interaction screening is that we basically, with our Kuramoto approach, is just like I showed before, this is an even a tougher sort of problem. We basically varied up until like a couple of degree differences and did hypothesis tests on waves going in different ways. And we can see that once you go from a couple of degrees far apart from each other, the area under the curve starts to increase substantially. So this is just showing with the Koromoto non-equilibrium framework, it can do that. It's like a positive control. But then what we did is that we collected data from a publication that I had while I was at UC San Diego. We had healthy human controls, and we had patients who had a diagnosis of gastrointestinal problems, such as gastroparesis. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it's very common in diabetes, as well as in Parkinson's disease and other conditions. It's when you have bad symptoms like nausea, et cetera. And importantly, what it means physiologically is that you have delayed emptying of your stomach. So it takes your stomach a much longer time to delay as compared to normal. So basically, one of the things that we did is we first asked the question, can we classify healthy controls from patients with these GI disorders just by looking at their spatial patterns? And it turns out that we have an area under the curve that's reasonably good, 0.71. But perhaps is even more interesting is that now when we get this kappa measure that comes out of this, one of the things that we took a look at is that, so these studies that we did from this 2019 paper at UC San Diego, was a 90-minute recording, 30 minutes before you ate a meal and 60 minutes after you ate a meal. And one of the things that we wanted to understand, and again, this is a stimulus response paradigm, non-equilibrium thermodynamics, how does the structure of the network change from pre to post using this measure of local efficiency that's given by this equation right here. And so basically what this is we get the topological structure of the graph. And so these D's basically just represent the distance, right, between nodes. And we look at the topological structure of the graph to look at local communication. And what we find is that in healthy controls, there's a substantial increase in this local communication efficiency as compared to patients with gastroparesis. So this is a new finding that we were able to establish based upon our network measure. So this is a high-level summary of the things that we've been able to do. And so the story that I'm telling, and this is really the work of two of my students. The first was Andrew Perley, who did the equilibrium thermodynamics work. Andrew defended his PhD about a year ago, did his PhD at Stanford, and he now is a postdoctoral scholar at Mass General Hospital, working with a guy named Sidney Cash, who anyone who knows intracranial EEG, he's like, he generates some of the biggest data sets for intracranial EEG in the world. Lots of people collaborate with him. So Andrew is in Boston there now, and Yun Wang just finished his third year of his PhD with me in bioengineering here at Stanford, and he developed a non-equilibrium thermodynamics approach. And so I believe that was my last slide. And so yeah, with that, I conclude, and I'd be happy to take questions. All right. Finished on time, you guys, despite the fact I started late. Yes, sir. So
You probably don't understand a lot of this because I didn't have the privilege of taking classes from Professor Fassler and
Professor Winful, yeah.
But this sounds really cool, and I do some related work. So the fundamental equation only consider the phase, but many of the biological oscillations has implications in both the phase and amplitude, and sometimes them together.
Absolutely.
What would be the possibility to tweak your model and consider both phase and amplitude?
It's a great question. So it turns out we're already doing that with one of my PhD students. And so we have a preprint right now that's under a review at a very prestigious journal. So we're fingers crossed that it gets accepted there. But we have a preprint where we looked at stomach-brain coupling during sleep. So does anyone have this anecdotal evidence of like if you eat? So for me, if I eat spicy food right before I go to bed, I have really vivid dreams. You know, and there's all these stories like in Ayurveda, otherwhere about the timing of meals relative to sleep. So we're able to partner with some people in Europe, and they collected these data sets in a sleep lab where we recorded the electrical activity of the stomach, the electrogastrogram, simultaneously with high density EEG. And one of the things that we're finding is really structured not only phase relationships, but also amplitude relationships in the gastric signal and its relationship to the EEG. So we have some measures. We have a preprint on that I can send to you. In that preprint, we also discovered something for the first time. the gastric signal is that there is something called an infraslow oscillation. So infraslow oscillations have recently been discovered in brain signals in the EEG and their implications in sleep pertaining to when these spindles occur and this noradrenaline is burst. It's a really, really hot topic in sleep. And so we began to study, and it's really fun. I still remember the day that my student kind of discovered it. She's like, I can't wrap my head around this. Why do I see this like rhythmic amplitude change in my gastric signal? So the high level idea is you get the gastric signal and you extract, let's say you get the instantaneous amplitude from the Hilbert transform, or you build a spectrogram and you look at the power and how it fluctuates over time. She saw that the power is fluctuating in an oscillating fashion. And it's very, very consistent in every human participant. It's around 0.01 hertz. And so we now are nerding out. And so our preprint goes into some of those measures and how we did that. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going on with not only phase, but also amplitude in the gastric signal. And our preprint, it's online, speaks to that and the discovery of this infraslow oscillation. We still don't know what the mechanism is. We have some hypotheses we talk about, neurovascular coupling, other things. But it is, yeah, amplitude is all on our minds right now too. Professor Fessler.
In the first part where you were using sparsity of the thetas that came from the muse, if I remember correctly.
Like kappa cosine theta, kappa sine theta, basically.
So then you showed a plane wave example. Could you help me understand where's the sparsity there? I think you probably have a mental picture of how these muse or kappas relate to what the waves look like, and I'm still trying to connect those.
That's a great question. I don't know if we could see this on Zoom, but if you think about a plane wave right here, you can imagine that you only basically, so imagine these are so imagine I have a plane wave and it's sort of going in this direction, right? Yeah. To sort of entrain this, you could just get local oscillators that are just basically neighbors. So if I'm this guy right here, I can only need neighbors. I don't need to go 2 nodes by, things like that. You see what I mean? But also statisticians, we don't want to make that assumption up front. We want to learn that from the data. But if I have a plane wave, I could just use like adjacent neighbors. I think someone else asked that question about, do you just need local neighbors, or do you, I think Professor Winful asked that question. So when we do our inference procedure, we're learning everything. We don't assume anything. But for a lot of structured phenomena, it might be something like only your nearby neighbors are relevant to capture.
That's like a banded structure then in the kappa matrix or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, I see. Because you showed banded matrices later, and I think you probably had a clear vision of that corresponds to this.
Yes.
Fine. Okay, I get that a little bit better now. And then my other question was, towards the end, you showed classification for distinguishing waves, I think, that were very close to each other, just a couple degrees or whatever. At that point, when you decide it becomes an estimation problem rather than a classification problem, like
that's a great point. I think we were okay. So that's a great point. So one thing we can do, and so I'm on this NIH UL1 grant with this guy named Lyle Mueller, and Lyle Mueller is the guy who was the first author on the cortical traveling waves paper. And Lyle, we've been writing some papers together, and Lyle. So one other fun fact, by the way, is that imagine if I just wanted to generate data according to the deterministic Kerr-Model model. The Kerr-Model model is like the most pristine example of nonlinear dynamics that occur. It turns out that you can actually lift to the complex domain and you can solve it algebraically. So he showed this in a recent paper. So once you take this going to the complex domain approach, what you can do is you can get the kappa ij's and the mu ij's and perform an appropriate matrix exponential in the complex domain, and you can basically estimate the direction of the traveling wave. So by taking this algebraic approach of going to the complex domain, you can, as you said, you can just perform estimation and just estimate the direction using this approach. So if anyone is interested, I can point you to his work. He told me he's been recruited to UT Dallas, so he was an assistant professor in math at Western University in Canada, and he recently has been appointed to on the faculty at UT Dallas. He actually came here to give a talk at Michigan in the math department because there's a lot of hardcore nonlinear oscillations people here at Michigan. I tried to invite some of them to the talk, yeah. So yeah, you could actually make an estimate. So once you estimate the kappas and the mu's, you could turn that into an estimate of the direction using this going to the complex domain and taking this algebraic approach. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So I have little knowledge in biology or health science. But I do study non-equilibrium statistical mechanics.
Okay.
So I have a couple questions in my mind. They might be out of scope, but they may help me understand your work. The first one is so the hallmark of non-equilibrium stat method is fluctuation dissipation theorem. Does that play a role, or do you see the fluctuation dissipation theorem like in
The dissipation theorem?
yeah, fluctuation dissipation theorem?
We basically are just trying to leverage the Langevin equation. That's literally all we're doing. We're just unraveling the Langevin equation. I'm curious how that might come in handy. So one thing that we do take advantage of when we go to the equilibrium domain, how we enforce the kappa matrix to be symmetric in the equilibrium domain is because, remember, to show the existence of the Boltzmann distribution, need to basically have a detailed balance to occur. And that detailed balance will basically boil down to having symmetry. Remember, it's something about a flux being, if I remember correctly, the curl of a certain phenomenon being zero. And when you go through the math, it boils down to having symmetry and an appropriate matrix. So that's one thing that we leverage to guarantee that the Langevin equation has a equilibrium distribution. Then in the more general case, literally all we're doing is we're just unraveling the definition of the derivative in the Langevin equation. That could come in handy somehow. So I'm gonna write that down to see if that could help constrain our estimation problem or something. Yeah.
So another question is like when you model the wave behavior, do you have to consider the scattering of the wave or the reflection of the wave?
We currently the type of applications that we care about within the context of electrophysiology in the brain and the stomach. Once we have an understanding of the multivariate phase relationship, that in some sense is governing the nature of the wave. And what I mean by that, I guess this is kind of a different way to think. I think it's a new way to think about it, because traditionally when people want to detect, is this a plane wave? Is this a radio wave? They do like circular linear correlations and do a lot of computing of statistics. Here, what we're doing is we are just saying that this obeys this Kuramoto-like phenomenon with these offsets, and basically the kappas in the Kuramoto matrix being large, basically is forcing those offsets to consistently behave that way in time. Even though each one is oscillating, the phase offsets between them are consistent. And all we do is that we uncover the nature of the wave by virtue of the kappas and the mu's. So one way to think about it is the kappa and the mu matrices, when they behave differently, that's in some sense how you can separate radio waves from plane waves. And how we show that is by virtue of our hypothesis test being so strong. Remember, our hypothesis testing scheme is so good, and so that's how we're showing that. So it's more interesting to me from like a electrical engineering applied probability person who took was it 401? Is that right? I don't know if that's still the number, right? Law 301, yeah, log likelihood ratio tests, and that allows you to distinguish those things. So when I took class with Professor Fessler, he didn't have any gray hair, just for the record. So I hope that's helpful, but I would love to follow up with you more. And a fun fact about me in American education is that and most people who get degrees in electrical engineering in the US do not learn thermodynamics. So I was double E faculty at Illinois, and then I got recruited to UC San Diego bioengineering. And the guy who recruited me is Shankar Subramanian, and he has a PhD in physics. And so he recruited me to have me completely redo the probability statistics class there. But then he taught a graduate class in thermodynamics. The first half was classical, and the other half was statistical thermodynamics. And after 2 years, I took over his class. And so I learned thermodynamics from teaching it. And I also ended up teaching the undergraduate thermal class. So all of my thermal knowledge came from teaching it after I transitioned to a bioengineering department. I think in other parts of the world, the double E departments force them to learn thermal. And if you think about it with circuits, it's so natural, right? But for some reason, American education in thermal, even in the 90s, was not required. Here, electromagnetics is not even required now for the double E degree. So Professor Wentworth rolled his eyes. So the double E degree in America is not what it is in other parts of the world. So, but luckily, I transitioned to a bioengineering department, and I got to learn thermal through that.
Some places even calculus is not required.
That is right. To be an engineer, you don't have to know calculus in certain places. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for being still attentive despite the fact we were 10 minutes late. We literally drove right from the airport. We landed. And this was fun and very happy I was able to give a technical talk in the room where I used to take classes. Yeah. So we have chalkboards anywhere in the ECS building now, or no? Or have all the chalkboards been replaced?
I haven't seen one for years.
Wow. Unfortunate.
Yeah, I know.
Now you're showing your age.
Right.